Please. This keeps a roof over my daughter's head. You wrote this? Yes, sir. In a truck stop bathroom, behind the wheel, after my daughter fell asleep. How touching. If you change these 4 stops, you save fuel every trip. What can a smelly truck driver teach anyone? Don't. This is where your little dream belongs. That was my last chance. Then you should have dreamed smaller. Get him out. Sir, stand up. I'm picking up what's mine. Chairwoman Quinn.
Why is he on the floor?
Val?
Caleb, I can explain.
I gave you my last $16.
3 months earlier, Valerie Quinn stood in the ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, holding a glass of champagne she had not taken a single sip from. Her midnight blue evening gown fit so perfectly that her private assistant had needed 2 tailors for a full week, and the diamond necklace around her neck could have bought an entire old rooming house on the south side of the city. On the stage, the auction host spoke about the Children's Hospital and the compassion of Seattle's business world. Valerie listened with the calm face her board of directors still called a negotiation advantage. At 34 years old, Valerie was not just a VIP guest sitting in the front row. She was the only heir and the female chairwoman of Quinn Logistics, a supply chain empire that controlled more than half of the shipping traffic along the west coast of the United States. Born into a family where even love was audited by profit margins, Valerie had been taught a brutal lesson early by her late billionaire father. No one walks towards you without hiding an invoice behind their back. Her massive fortune did not give her freedom. It turned her into a moving safe. She was too used to rooms like this. Handshakes that lasted longer than needed. Men who spoke about vision while glancing at her wrist to guess the watch model. Rich families placing their sons beside her like investments. After making 1 circle around the room, Valerie set the champagne glass on the tray of a passing server. She did not break the glass. She did not let her expression lose control. Only her thumb and index finger found the table number card in her hand, then tore it into small pieces. Whenever she could not show emotion, she tore paper. She left the hotel through the side door used by staff. In the underground parking garage, her private driver stood beside the Bentley, but Valerie told him to go home early. She opened the trunk, unzipped her gym bag, took off the high heels, and pulled off the evening gown in quick movements. A few minutes later, the woman magazines called the Queen of Logistics disappeared under an old gray hoodie, faded black joggers, and canvas shoes she had made dirty on purpose. She wiped off the red lipstick, tied her hair low, and got into an ordinary sedan. The anonymous dating app lit up on her phone. Her profile only said, Val 34, former data entry worker, looking for a job after being laid off. It was a clean, careful lie, poor enough to make gold diggers disappear and normal enough to keep people from asking too much. She knew it was not kind. But after years of being seen as a breathing bank account, Valerie had started to believe that the truth about her always ruined every meeting before it could become human. A man named Caleb Turner replied after 9 minutes. His message was short, with no heart emojis, no request for full-body photos, and no polished opening line. He said he was finishing his last shift near Georgetown, and if she still wanted to meet, there was a late-night diner under the Spokane Street overpass. Valerie looked at the message longer than necessary. Outside the car window, guests in tuxedos were still walking out of the hotel. She started the engine and drove south. The diner sat between an old gas station, a truck lot, and a car wash that had already turned off its lights. Half of the neon sign that said Betty's kept blinking out. Melted snow had turned gray along the curb. The smell of burnt coffee, frying oil, and cheap cleaner hit Valerie when she pushed the door open. In the corner near the window, Caleb sat with his back to the truck lot. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a denim jacket with worn fleece at the elbows. The hand resting beside his coffee cup had many calluses and a few streaks of engine grease that had not washed off. He stood when he saw her, a little slowly because of exhaustion. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, but he looked straight at her, not scanning her clothes to place a price on her. Caleb had just ended a call before she arrived. His phone still lay face down on the table, the screen glowing with the name of a commercial bank. Valerie heard the last few words. If the overdue loan was not paid, the lender would move forward with repossessing the truck within the week. Caleb turned the phone off, pushed it into his jacket pocket, and pulled out her chair as if that call had not just dragged his whole life one step lower. Valerie sat down. The server placed 2 greasy plastic menus on the table. Caleb ordered more coffee for her and asked if she was cold. Valerie shook her head, but her canvas shoes had soaked up melted snow from the parking lot, and her toes were painfully cold. He noticed but did not say anything. He only pushed the tissue box toward her, then turned his face toward the window as if giving her space to wipe her shoes without feeling ashamed. They talked for almost 30 minutes. Valerie stayed in the role of Val, the laid-off data entry worker with student loan debt. Caleb did not try to be charming, he answered slowly, sometimes pausing because his eyes drifted toward the dark blue Peterbilt parked under the yellow light. He said very little about his wife, only that she had died of cancer 3 years earlier and had left him a daughter named Mia. When he mentioned Mia, his hand touched the chest pocket where he kept a laminated photo. Valerie saw the corner of the picture, a little girl smiling with one front tooth missing, her hair tied unevenly, hugging an old teddy bear. When the server came back, Valerie pretended to touch her coat pocket, then looked down as if she had just remembered something bad. She said she had left her wallet in a friend's car, her voice low enough that the next table could not hear. This was a test she had used many times. Wealthy men were often generous when they thought they were investing in her. Ordinary men usually became awkward, sometimes annoyed, or sometimes gone. Valerie knew the act was unfair, but the wounded part of her still wanted to see the real reaction before giving anyone another piece of her life. Caleb looked at the menu, then at her. He did not ask if she was lying. He did not frown. He only ordered the cheapest smoked meatloaf plate with toast, no salad. After the server left, he said the coffee here was terrible, but hot food was a little less terrible. That ordinary sentence made Valerie look down at her hands. She had prepared herself for a complaint, for a lecture about responsibility. She had not prepared for a man being threatened by a bank over his truck, still trying to keep him from feeling embarrassed. The food came out after 11 minutes. Steam rose from the dark brown gravy. Caleb picked up the fork, cut a small piece, then stopped when he saw her still holding the coffee cup with both hands to warm herself. He pushed the plate toward her so gently that it only slid a short distance across the edge of the table. He said his stomach was acting up and asked her to help him eat it. Valerie looked at him. Under the fluorescent lights, she saw the hollows under his eyes from 14 hours of driving and too many sleepless nights. She also saw the way he swallowed when the smell of hot meat rose from the plate. She ate slowly, one small bite at a time. Caleb drank black coffee and looked out at the truck lot now and then. He did not make a show of it, and he did not watch her waiting for gratitude. When the server asked if they needed anything else, he shook his head before Valerie could open her mouth. At the table beside them, another driver complained about diesel prices. At the counter, a small TV played the late-night stock market news. Valerie heard the name of her company pass by, but Caleb did not react. To him, she was still only Val, the woman with wet shoes, unemployed, trying to eat dinner without bothering anyone. When it was time to pay, the server placed the bill in the middle of the table. $16, coffee included. Caleb pulled out a dark blue credit card and handed it to her. The card reader gave a denied beep. He looked at the screen, then handed the card over a second time. The beep repeated, dry and short. The server said nothing, but her eyes moved to Valerie for 1 second. Caleb took the card back, his face unchanged, only his ears turning red. He opened his wallet. There were not many things inside. A commercial driver's license, Mia's photo, an old health insurance card, one $10 bill, and 6 wrinkled $1 bills folded deep inside a side pocket. He took each bill out and smoothed it flat on the table with his thumb. Valerie saw him pause over the final $1 bill for a little longer than a beat. She understood, without needing an explanation, that this was not extra money. It was the smallest emergency fund of a family living at the edge. Breakfast money, milk, money for a vending machine if Mia got hungry after school. Valerie was about to say she had found her wallet. But Caleb had already placed the money on the bill, pushed it toward the edge of the table, and stood up. He thanked her for meeting him and told her to get home safely. Not one word of blame. Not one sentence that made her feel she owed him. He only zipped up his jacket, nodded to the server, and walked out faster than he had walked in, like a man who wanted to leave the place that had just witnessed his lack before his pride could spill out. Valerie stayed seated. The $16 receipt had a grease mark in one corner, lying beside her cold coffee cup. She had been given diamonds, shares, lakeside mansions, and trips designed to impress her. But none of them had ever tightened her throat like $16 smoothed flat by the calloused hand of a man who thought she was poorer than him. She took her real wallet from the hoodie pocket, looked at the black card inside, then put it away again. For the first time in many years, money was no longer a tool that helped her control the situation. It only made her feel more ashamed. Outside, the sleet fell harder. Valerie left extra cash for the tip and walked out to the parking lot. She meant to call Caleb back, at least to pay for the meal, to say something that would not ruin everything. But she stopped under the diner awning. Caleb's dark blue Peterbilt sat still under the parking lot light, its hood raised. Caleb stood in front of the engine, one hand holding a wrench, the other holding his phone with the flashlight on. He tapped a metal part lightly, then stopped, lowered his head, and let his broad shoulders sag in the cold rain. A truck is not just a truck. To Caleb, it was his office, his contract, his rent money, Mia's insurance, and the only way he knew to avoid asking anyone for pity. If the truck died and the bank repossessed it before he could make the overdue payment, everything else would fall with it. Valerie stood in the shadow beside the broken soda machine, her hand on the pocket where the black card could solve the problem in a few minutes. She could call a private rescue team. She could buy him a new truck. She could step out and admit that Val did not exist. But she didn't do it right away. The habit of control kept her still. Years of being hunted for her money made her look at every kind moment through a glass wall of doubt. Caleb had just given her his last $16, but part of Valerie was still afraid that if she revealed the truth, all that honesty would disappear, replaced by the way people usually looked at her, calculating faster, changing their tone faster, falling in love faster than felt believable. She stood there, watching the man who had given her his dinner tapping a wrench against a dying truck, and for the first time, she realized that her wealth did not make her superior to him. It only made her silence in that moment more cruel. Caleb closed the hood after almost 20 minutes. He rested his forehead against the cold metal, then took out his phone and called someone. Valerie could not hear what he said, but she saw him open his wallet again, look into the empty pocket, then put it away. He wiped his face with his sleeve, pulled his jacket up to his neck, and walked toward the main road, probably to catch the night bus home to Mia. The truck stayed behind in the sleet like a large animal that had been forgotten. Valerie stepped out of the shadows after he had gone. She stood beside the Peterbilt and placed her hand on the cold paint. In the passenger side window, she saw a child's drawing taped inside, a blue truck, a tall man, and a little girl standing beside him with purple shoes. Under it, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Daddy's Road Trip." Valerie looked at that line for a long time. Behind her, the diner was still glowing, the $16 receipt was still in her pocket, and her lie, which had only been built for self-defense, had just begun to touch the real life of a child who had never known she was being pulled into an adult's test. 2 weeks after the night at the diner, Valerie still kept the $16 receipt in her desk drawer. Every time she approved a multi-million-dollar expense, she saw the thin corner of the grease-stained paper, like a small object lying still inside a world of balance sheets and contracts. Caleb Turner did not text every day. He did not send the usual sweet lines either. Sometimes he disappeared for 30 hours because of a night route, then only sent one short message saying Mia had eaten breakfast and the truck was running again for now. She had gone too far from the first test, but every meeting with Caleb pulled the lie even farther. They did not go to fancy restaurants. Caleb chose the park near Green Lake or a bench under a shelter at Gasworks Park when it rained. He brought coffee in paper cups and always placed her cup on the inner side of the bench so the wind would not knock it over. Valerie was still Val, the unemployed data entry worker carrying student loan debt. Caleb never asked why someone without a job could have such a sharp view of the freight market. Maybe he was polite. Maybe he was too tired to be suspicious. One Thursday afternoon, they sat on a bench looking down at the lake, between the sound of barking dogs and bicycle wheels on wet pavement. Caleb spread a piece of sandwich paper across his knee, borrowed Valerie's pen, and began drawing delivery routes with straight lines and circles. He was not bragging. He was only explaining because she had asked why his truck passed through Tacoma 3 times in the same week and still did not make enough money for fuel. The numbers fell from his mouth as naturally as breathing. Diesel cost per mile, dead time at yards, unpaid waiting fees, scheduling errors that forced drivers to run empty for hundreds of miles because containers were placed at the wrong gate. Valerie looked at the sandwich paper, curious at first, then focused like someone realizing she was hearing something the executive team had missed. Caleb pointed to a spot near the port of Seattle and said that big company often forced independent drivers to take short routes during rush hour to cover forecasting mistakes. He did not know it was Whitmore Atlas, Valerie's company. He only called them the glass people because the people making decisions sat behind glass doors and did not know how long it took an 18-wheeler to turn around when the roads were icy. He calculated in his head that simply changing the order of 4 stops could save nearly 11 gallons per trip. That number was far beyond the waste Derek had reported to the board as normal fuel variation. She pulled a small piece of paper from the pocket of her hoodie, about to take notes, then recognized the habit of tearing paper. She put her hand back into her pocket and held her fingers still. Caleb thought she did not understand, so he turned the sandwich paper toward her and drew it again with a simpler example. That patience made her ashamed. On the 52nd floor, vice presidents used colorful charts and management terms to hide the gaps in what they did not know. The man in front of her used sandwich paper, a nearly dry pen, and highway experience to point out a $1 million hole. From that day on, Valerie began listening to Caleb differently. Not as a kind man who happened to be poor, but as a field expert pushed so low by the system that no one had ever asked what he knew. He told her about way stations, places where drivers had to wait 6 hours without pay, and contracts with small lines that pushed maintenance risk onto the driver. He did not speak with bitterness. He spoke like someone who had taken a machine apart in his mind and knew exactly which gear was grinding down the next one. Valerie tried bringing him a made-up problem. If a warehouse in Kent was usually 90 minutes late because of a shortage of loaders, should they add staff or change the container pickup schedule? Caleb asked 5 questions before answering. Which shift was late the most? How many trucks arrived in the same time window? Who was penalized under the contract when trucks waited? Was the freight frozen or dry? Were the dock doors high enough? Valerie watched him peel the problem apart, layer by layer, and remembered 3 consultants who charged $400 an hour and had not asked even 2 of those questions. And yet, instead of telling the truth, she built one more test. The fear of being used had grown so deep it had become a reflex. On Saturday night at 11:08, when snow began to whiten the edge of I-5, she called Caleb. She said her old car had a flat tire near the Tukwila exit and that she did not know who else to call. The truth was her rented sedan was running perfectly and the spare tire was still in the trunk. Valerie stood under the overpass, her coat pulled tight, phone in her hand, hearing a small hospital monitor and a child coughing on the other end of the line. Caleb went silent for a few seconds. He asked where she was, whether the doors were locked, and whether she was standing far enough away from the lane. He did not complain. He did not ask why she was calling so late. 34 minutes later, his old pickup pulled onto the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. Caleb stepped out in a hoodie, his hair messy, his face unshaven, carrying a toolbox. Valerie saw the paper hospital wristband around his wrist. Mia had a fever from mild pneumonia, and he had just brought her home after 6 hours waiting in the emergency room. Snow hit his face as he knelt beside the tire. He held a flashlight between his teeth, his hands turning red from the cold motor oil caught under his nails as he loosened each lug nut. Valerie stood a few steps away, the black card in her pocket feeling hot against her body. She had wanted him to come. She had wanted to see what he would choose, and his choice made her feel smaller. Caleb did not know he was being tested. He only pulled out the spare, mounted it, tightened the nuts in a star pattern, then stood and brushed snow from his knees. When she took out a $50 bill and offered it to him, he looked at the money as if it had been placed in the wrong place. He told her to keep it because people in the same hard place should not make money from each other's bad luck. That sentence followed Valerie all the way back to the penthouse. She walked across heated stone floors, past a kitchen where her private chef had left hot soup ready in the cabinet, then stood for a long time in front of the bathroom mirror. A few melted snowflakes from the highway shoulder were still on her coat. She let down her hair, took the refused $50 bill from her pocket, and placed it beside the sink. That whole night, Valerie did not open her laptop. She only sat by the glass wall looking out at the city, remembering Caleb's hospital wristband and the way he had asked whether she was far enough from traffic before asking anything about himself. The next Sunday, Caleb invited Val to his apartment in Renton, not as a romantic date, but because Mia wanted to meet the woman who had eaten her father's meatloaf. The 3-story building sat beside a cracked parking lot, and the hallway smelled of damp laundry and cheap dinners. Caleb had cleaned the apartment so carefully that the old parts became even more obvious. The worn sofa covered with a clean blanket, the kitchen table with one leg supported by a piece of wood, the fridge covered with a medical debt calendar and Mia's 3rd grade schedule. Mia opened the door, small and thin, her hair braided unevenly, her eyes bright but cautious. She held an old teddy bear under one arm like a shield. Valerie brought an apple pie from a regular bakery, not daring to bring anything too expensive. Mia thanked her very seriously, then ran into the kitchen to get 3 mismatched plates. While Caleb made coffee, Valerie saw Mia sitting on the floor near the window, using superglue to fix the front of her purple sneakers. The front sole had opened like a mouth, showing the white fabric inside. The girl pressed the 2 sides of the shoe together and counted to 60, as if reading the instructions on the glue tube. Caleb saw it from the kitchen. His hand stopped on the coffee pot lid, then kept twisting, as if moving slowly enough could keep anyone from noticing that his eyes had changed direction. Dinner was pasta with tomato sauce and thin slices of sausage. Caleb served Mia first, then Valerie and himself last. Mia talked about her spelling test, about a classmate with light-up shoes, then stopped in the middle of a sentence when she saw her father looking at the purple shoes by the window. She immediately said her shoes were still good. The glue just needed to dry overnight. Valerie lowered her eyes to the plate of pasta, feeling the diamonds in the safe at home become painfully meaningless. Not because she pitied them. Because she saw 2 people in front of her trying to protect each other's pride with very small words. When she left, Valerie deliberately tucked a $100 bill under the apple pie plate, leaving it visible enough that Caleb would find it after she was gone. She told herself it was not a test anymore, only help. But deep inside, the old question remained. If he kept it, would everything change? The next morning at 7:20, the front desk of the building Valerie used as her fake address called to say someone was looking for Val in the lobby. Valerie came down in a regular coat, her heart beating fast. Caleb stood there, his hair wet, work boots, muddy, breathing hard as if he had walked a long way. He had walked 3 miles from the nearest bus stop because he did not want to spend more money on a ride. In his hand was the $100 bill folded in half. He said Mia had found it and thought Val dropped it, and that if Val was in debt, she should not be careless with her own survival like that. Valerie looked at the money in his hand. Behind Caleb, the receptionist pretended to arrange pens but kept glancing at the mud on the stone floor. Caleb did not see it, or maybe he saw it and did not let it touch him. He only placed the bill into Valerie's hand, returning something that did not belong to him. In her mind, the invisible contract between them began to crack, but Caleb still did not know he was standing in front of the person who had the power to sign or erase his name from the routes that fed his family, and she still did not have the courage to stop it right there. Valerie almost told the truth in that exact moment, her real name, the penthouse, the company, the $16 receipt in her drawer. But Caleb's phone rang first. He looked at the screen, his expression changing very little, but Valerie saw his shoulders drop as if someone had placed another 50 pounds on his back. The email was from Whitmore Atlas, the freight contracts division. The message was short, cold, and full of automated signatures. All freelance driver contracts in the Northwest region would be terminated within 72 hours for cost restructuring under the direction of Chief Operating Officer Derek Mallory. Caleb read it a second time, then a third. The $100 bill was still in Valerie's hand, but now it looked like a useless piece of paper in front of the hole that had just opened beneath the man standing before her. His truck was still under debt. Rent was overdue. Mia needed new shoes and medicine after the pneumonia. He did not curse, slam his phone, or make a scene in front of the receptionist. He only lifted his hand to rub the bridge of his nose, then put the phone into his jacket pocket. When he looked up, his sleep-red eyes looked at Valerie as if he was still trying not to worry her. Valerie heard Derek's name in her mind like metal falling onto the floor. That was her CO, the man who had said in last week's meeting that the restructuring did not significantly affect core drivers. She had approved a cost framework review, but she had never approved mass contract termination within 72 hours. Derek had used her signature, or at least used her distance from the ground. And the first person crushed under that decision was standing in front of her, still believing she was only Val, a poor woman who needed to be protected from a dropped $100 bill. Caleb folded the phone screen into his palm. He said he had to go pick up Mia, then turned toward the door. Valerie took one step after him, her lips parting. The truth had risen to her throat. But Caleb turned back first, trying to smile like someone afraid of ruining another person's day. He told her not to worry, that he would figure it out. That sentence was not for him, it was for her, so she would not have to stand there feeling like she had just watched a family fall. The glass door closed behind Caleb. Valerie stood in the lobby, so clean it reflected the ceiling lights, the $100 bill in her hand, her phone buzzing again and again with calls from the office. Outside, Caleb pulled his hood up and stepped into the rain, his back broad but slower than before. The experiment she had called self-defense had just touched a truth that could no longer hide under the name Val. She had not only lied to a kind man. She was standing high above the very machine that had just cut off the lifeline of him and the child who called him Dad. 3 days after the contract termination email, Caleb stood before the glass counter of a pawn shop on Rainier, placing his father's gold-plated mechanical watch on the gray velvet pad. The glass had a scratch near the 4 o'clock mark, but the back cover was still engraved with the words his father had received when he retired from the steel mill. Work honestly, stand tall. Caleb set it down with 2 fingers, as if he was afraid that holding it any longer would make him change his mind. The man behind the counter turned the watch under the yellow light and typed a few numbers into the calculator. He did not ask where it came from. In a pawn shop, a seller's memories do not count toward the price. Caleb looked through the glass door. Light rain fell on the sidewalk. Mia was at school, wearing the purple shoes that had been glued back together, though the front had opened again after gym class. Last night she had placed her cereal bowl upside down over the rent notice. Across the street, inside a black SUV with dark windows, Valerie sat motionless. That morning she had only meant to go to headquarters earlier than usual, but when she saw Caleb step off the bus in front of the pawn shop, she told the driver to stop. Through the bulletproof glass, she watched him sell the last object that still connected him to a kinder past than the present. In the pocket of her coat were 17 messages from the executive team and a copy of the email Derek had sent to freelance drivers. That evening, Caleb met Val in the parking lot behind the Renton Public Library. He did not talk about the watch. He wore an old jacket, worn jeans, and his hair was still damp from a quick shower. Valerie noticed his empty wrist but did not ask. He placed a carefully stapled stack of papers on the hood of the car. It was the route optimization plan he had rewritten after the contract termination email. The edges of the pages were slightly curled from being left near the heater, and it came with hand-drawn charts about yard waiting time, container cycles, and fuel costs. Caleb said he was going to the Whitmore Atlas headquarters the next morning. He did not think he would get to meet the chairwoman or any major executive. He only wanted to hand the plan to HR or operations, hoping it might lead to a low-level yard supervisor position. He knew he did not have a college degree and the old suit had become tight across his shoulders, but he also knew that 16 years behind the wheel had taught him things that did not show up in spreadsheets. Valerie listened, her hand hidden in her coat pocket, clenched so tightly her nails pressed into her skin. She had prepared herself to tell the truth, but Caleb bent down and took a pair of clean children's shoes from the back seat. He said if he got work, the first thing he would do was buy Mia a new pair of shoes, the kind strong enough for her to run in gym class without checking the front of them every few minutes. He said it with a small smile, as if a father's dream only needed to begin with his child not feeling ashamed in a school hallway. Valerie could not speak anymore. She stood under the parking lot light, hearing the papers on the car hood tremble softly in the wind. With one call, the next morning's meeting would no longer be a gamble, but if she used power before telling the truth, she would once again be steering his life from the shadows. The next morning, Caleb woke up at 5:40. The apartment was still dark, with only the kitchen light falling across the fridge covered in bills. He ironed the only white shirt he had left and tied the dark blue tie his wife had once bought from a discount store. The old suit pulled tight at his shoulders, and the trouser hem sat a little short. Mia sat at the kitchen table, her hair not yet fully brushed, watching him fix his collar for the third time. She did not ask if he was scared. She only pushed a small paper bag toward him with a butter sandwich inside. Written on it in colored marker were the words, "Daddy knows the roads better than they do." Caleb read the sentence and folded the top of the bag carefully. He kissed the top of Mia's head, reminded her to give the doctor's note to the teacher if she coughed too much, and went downstairs. The truck was still at the repair yard, so he took 2 buses to downtown Seattle. On the second bus, he kept the folder on his lap, careful not to let the people standing near him bend the papers. Office workers got on near Pioneer Square, the smell of expensive coffee mixing with wet raincoats. Caleb looked at his reflection in the bus window and pulled his sleeve down to cover his empty wrist. Whitmore Atlas headquarters stood inside a 52-story tower with a main lobby paved in white marble. Caleb stopped in front of the revolving door and wiped the soles of his work boots on the mat, even though he knew mud still sat inside the cracks. Inside, leather shoes clicked cleanly across the shining floor. The receptionist looked up, her office smile slowing slightly when she saw the old suit, the rough hands, and the shoes that did not belong with the private elevators behind her. Caleb said he wanted to meet someone in HR or operations. He handed over the folder and explained that he was a former contract driver with a proposal to help reduce fuel costs. The receptionist took the papers, scanned the first page, then asked him to wait. Caleb sat on a leather chair beside a decorative plant, his back straight, both hands resting on his knees. On the wall screen, a Whitmore Atlas promotional video played on repeat. Clean trucks rolling down highways, smiling employees, and the slogan, "Respecting every mile." Caleb looked at that line for a little longer, then lowered his head to straighten the corner of the folder. On the 47th floor, Derek Mallory had just ended a call with a tire supplier in which he held an indirect stake through his brother-in-law's company. Canceling the freelance driver contracts was not only cost-cutting, it pushed roots toward a new partner group where each shipment would create hidden commissions for him. When his assistant reported that a former driver was in the lobby asking to meet operations, Derek gave a short laugh. He did not like cracks appearing in polished places. Derek came down to the lobby with 2 middle managers. He wore a charcoal suit, shiny Italian shoes, and an executive badge glittering on his chest. From a distance, he had already seen Caleb stand up. Derek did not offer a handshake. He looked from the cracked toes of Caleb's work boots up to the slightly tight collar, then stopped at the folder. Caleb introduced himself briefly, keeping his voice calm. He said he was not there to cause trouble, only to present a solution based on real route data. Derek took the folder, flipped through a few pages like someone looking at a cheap menu, then frowned when he saw hand-drawn charts showing waiting points and empty runs caused by decisions from the central office. Several employees walking by began to slow down. The security guard at the desk looked over. Derek read the names of the transfer yards, the congestion times, and the numbers he had tried to blur in reports. His smile thinned. He asked whether a smelly truck driver truly thought he could teach people with business degrees how to run a supply chain. The sentence carried loudly enough for the receptionist to lower her face toward the keyboard. Caleb did not answer right away. He looked at the folder in Derek's hand and then said the data was in every fuel receipt and every yard waiting slip if the company was willing to read it. That calmness made Derek even more irritated. He yanked the stack of papers and tore the first page in half right in the middle of the lobby. The sound of ripping paper cut through the soft background music. He tore several more pages, letting the charts fall onto the marble floor, then threw the rest toward the carpet at Caleb's feet. A young manager behind Derek swallowed hard but did not step forward. Security left the desk. Caleb stood still. His jaw tightened. For a few seconds, he looked at the pieces of paper around his shoes. They were the sleepless nights after Mia had gone to bed, the calculations on the kitchen table, the money from selling his father's watch, the bus ride that morning, and the colored marker sentence on the lunch bag. He could have stepped forward and grabbed Derek by the collar. But he thought of Mia in 3rd grade, the rent papers, and the fact that a father dragged out of a lobby by security would not be able to buy his daughter new shoes. He bent down. Each torn piece was picked up by calloused hands. Caleb did not rush. He gathered the ripped pages, smoothed one readable corner, and placed it back into the old folder. Employees in the lobby looked over secretly from behind computer screens and coffee cups. A woman at the reception desk lifted her hand to her throat, then lowered it. The security guard stood 6 steps from Caleb, waiting for an order. Derek looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. Satisfaction flashed across his face. He signaled for security to remove this security issue. At that exact moment, the VIP elevator chimed. The steel doors opened from the private area behind the Whitmore Atlas logo. Valerie stepped out with 2 lawyers, the communications director, and a guard. She wore a black suit. Her hair was in a low bun, and held documents for an emergency meeting about the driver contract terminations. She had meant to come down to the lobby to meet Caleb before Derek could interfere, but the elevator had been delayed by a call from the board. The moment she saw the torn papers on the floor and Caleb kneeling, she understood she had arrived 1 beat too late, and that beat could not be taken back. Derek turned around. His face switched from contempt to respect, as if someone had flipped a switch. He lowered his head, called her chairwoman, and said a troublemaker was creating a security problem. From the floor, Caleb heard the same voice change, smoother and lower now. He picked up the last piece of paper, the one with the word Mia accidentally drawn in the corner the night before, and looked up. Their eyes met across the marble lobby. In the first moment, Caleb did not understand. He saw Val, the woman in the gray hoodie from the diner, the woman who had let him change a tire in the snow, the woman who had stepped into his small apartment and eaten pasta with Mia. But in front of him, she did not look unemployed. She did not look buried in student debt. She did not belong to public parks and cheap coffee cups. Everyone around her moved back half a step. Derek stood angled toward her, waiting for an order. The guard looked at Caleb like a risk. Valerie opened her mouth, but no sound came out right away. The documents in her hand bent slightly under her grip. Caleb looked at the silver pin on the lapel of her suit, the unnamed elevator badge on the guard's wrist, and the Whitmore Atlas logo behind her. Every piece of life he had told Val over the last 3 months came back one by one. His wife's medical debt, Mia's torn shoes, the truck about to be repossessed, and his father's watch. He remembered paying his last $16 for her meal, remembered the $100 bill she had dropped, and remembered the 11 p.m. call to change her tire. Derek was still speaking, but Caleb no longer heard him clearly. The large lobby kept moving around them, the revolving doors bringing people in, and the coffee machine at the counter hissing steam, and the promotional screen repeating the line respecting every mile. Caleb slowly stood, holding the torn folder to his chest. Valerie stepped toward him, but he moved back 1 step. Not much, just enough to turn the space between them into a clean cut. She was no longer Val in his eyes. She was the person who owned the building where he had just been humiliated, Derek's superior, the name on the contract that had just cut off his family's lifeline, and the woman who had sat in Mia's kitchen and stayed silent. It showed in the way Caleb lowered his eyes to his hands, where the torn papers shook lightly under his grip. Then he looked at Valerie one more time, not with loud anger, but with an emptiness that made her stop moving. Security waited for instructions. Derek still stood beside her. His office smile began to shake when he realized the silence between the chairwoman and the driver did not feel like an encounter with a stranger. Valerie turned toward him, all warmth gone from her face. But before she could speak, Caleb removed the visitor badge from around his neck and placed it on the reception counter. He didn't throw it. He didn't make a noise. He set it down like returning something that had never belonged to him. When Caleb turned toward the revolving door, Valerie finally called his name. Not Caleb Turner in the chairwoman's voice. Not Mr. Turner in a corporate voice. Just Caleb, like in the park, like in the diner. He stopped for half a beat, long enough for her to hope there might still be a way back. But he did not turn around. He walked out of the lobby, carrying his cracked work boots, the torn route plan, and the truth that had just revealed the woman he trusted most had not only hidden a name but also had lied. She had hidden an entire world standing above his life. Valerie called Caleb's name right before the revolving door swallowed him into the crowd on the street. Her voice carried across the marble lobby, not loud, but enough to make Derek freeze and make the 2 guards stop. Caleb didn't turn around right away. He stood inside the glass circle of the revolving door, holding the torn papers against his chest, the shoulders of his old suit still carrying a few drops of rain from the bus stop. But that name, falling from the mouth of a chairwoman inside a 52-story tower, sounded like something borrowed and returned too late. Valerie stepped past Derek, her eyes never leaving Caleb. She didn't look at the receptionist holding her breath, and she didn't look at the employees pretending to be busy behind their screens. She only raised one hand, signaling the guards to step back. Derek turned with her, the office smile still trying to cling to his face. He began talking about security risk, about a former driver entering the executive area, about how he was only protecting a professional workplace. Valerie listened to all of it without blinking. Caleb finally turned back. His eyes moved past Derek, past the Whitmore Atlas logo on the wall, then stopped on Valerie's face. He didn't ask her why. He didn't ask how much of the last 3 months had been real. His silence hurt Valerie more than any accusation could have. She looked at the torn papers in his hands and the cracked work boots on the polished stone floor. She turned to Derek. Her voice was calm enough to make the people around them even more afraid. She ordered him, Caleb, and the entire senior operations team to go to the boardroom immediately. Derek lowered his voice and reminded her that the man didn't have an appointment and that the file hadn't been verified. Valerie only looked at him for a few more seconds, then told the head of legal to have security seal every email connected to the driver contract termination. That sentence drained the color from Derek's face. Caleb stood still for one more beat. He could have walked away. But the papers in his hands still had Mia's name written in one corner, and behind his wounded pride were the rent, the cough medicine, and the purple shoes opening at the front. He followed them into the elevator. The private elevator rose in an uncomfortable silence. Derek stood near the door, holding his phone but not daring to text. Valerie stood slightly behind Caleb, close enough to see the old suit collar rubbing against the back of his neck, far enough not to force him to accept her presence. Caleb watched the floor numbers light up. The glass boardroom on the 52nd floor looked out over Elliott Bay. The board members were already present for the emergency meeting on cost restructuring. They turned when Caleb walked in, and in many of their eyes he recognized the same familiar measuring process. Shoes, clothes, hands, posture, then conclusion. Derek immediately used that empty space. He said Caleb was a disgruntled former contract driver who had caused a disturbance in the lobby and might be trying to create media pressure to reverse a legal business decision. Valerie didn't argue. She set her document bag down, opened her laptop, then asked her assistant for tape. Everyone watched as she pieced together the torn pages of Caleb's file on the glass table. Caleb stood a few steps away, still holding the old folder cover. He didn't know what he was supposed to see in that moment, a late apology or a display of power. When Valerie finished putting the first page back together, she placed it under the document camera. On the large screen appeared the hand-drawn lines, stops, empty miles, and notes written in blue pen. Derek gave a quiet laugh, but the sound died quickly when Valerie zoomed in on the first section. She pointed to the Tacoma to Kent route that looped back to Seattle within the same time window. Caleb had once explained it with sandwich paper. Valerie had taken his words, checked them against internal data, then matched them against fuel receipts from 8 quarters. She stated each number clearly: average waiting time, idle miles, cold freight penalties, and overtime costs at transfer yards. Every sentence she said had clean, exact data behind it. One board member leaned forward. Valerie opened another page where Caleb had proposed changing the order of 4 stops and grouping containers by dock gate instead of by sales region. She said that method would save 11 gallons per trip on the sample route, and if expanded across the Northwest region, the company would save at least $4.2 million in fuel every quarter. The plan from a smelly truck driver had just revealed the hole that Derek's department had called normal variation. The room didn't explode. A woman on the board slowly closed her pen. The head of internal audit looked at Derek for the first time as if he were looking at bad debt. Caleb heard the number $4.2 million and didn't feel happy. He only remembered writing that calculation on the kitchen table while Mia slept. The numbers that hadn't been enough to buy him a hearing in the lobby were now being projected on the wall only because Valerie said they were worth hearing. Derek began to fight back. He said drivers' proposals often oversimplified the problem, that field data didn't reflect the pressure of national contracts, and that ending driver contracts was meant to protect shareholders. Valerie pressed a key. The screen shifted to the internal email chain that legal had just sealed. In it, Derek had been communicating with a new tire supplier about shifting routes to a replacement partner group. A supporting file showed the consulting company behind that supplier with family ties to Derek's brother-in-law. Chairs moved back, phones were placed face down. Assistant stopped typing. Valerie didn't call him a thief. She let the documents do that. She asked the internal audit to confirm that the indirect commissions had been flagged in the red report. The audit director stood, his voice dry, and explained that his team had begun the review after Valerie requested an independent check at 2:13 a.m. The transactions were enough to suspend Derek's executive authority, take back his equipment, freeze his system access, and send the file to outside legal counsel. Derek looked around the table, searching for an ally. No one held his gaze for long. Caleb stood there, hearing his name mentioned as the first source of the discovery. Valerie said that over the past 6 weeks she had quietly compared Caleb observations with operating data. He turned toward her very slowly. 6 weeks. That meant when he thought they were only sitting in the park drinking coffee, she had been putting each sentence from him into the system. It meant his intelligence had been recognized, but secretly under a fake name. In Caleb's eyes, that was another layer of betrayal. Derek saw the opening. He immediately said Valerie was letting personal feelings interfere with a management decision, that she had a private relationship with this man, and was using the board to make favoritism look legal. Valerie didn't dodge it. She looked at Caleb for one moment, then turned back to the board. She admitted that she had met Caleb under an incomplete identity. Then Valerie continued, her voice still steady, saying that her personal mistake didn't make the data false, and because there was a conflict of interest, she was asking the board to vote based on the independent audit. That was the move Derek hadn't expected. Valerie placed herself inside the area of responsibility. The board chair called for an urgent vote on suspending Derek Mallory during the investigation. One hand after another went up. There was no rush, but not one hand stood with Derek. The decision was entered into the minutes. The head of security stepped into the boardroom, not to drag Caleb out like in the lobby, but to collect Derek's executive badge. Derek removed it from his neck and placed it on the table while the attorney stood beside him with a suspension envelope and evidence preservation notice. When Derek was let out, his Italian shoes passed beside Caleb's cracked work boots. This time, no one looked down at Caleb's shoes to laugh. A young assistant quietly picked up one last piece of paper from near the chair leg and placed it on the table for him. Caleb took it and gave a very small nod. It didn't return his father's watch right away. It didn't erase the contract termination email from his phone. But it made the man who had just torn up his hope leave the building through the path of someone being controlled, not someone giving orders. Valerie turned back to the board. She proposed temporarily restoring freelance driver contracts for 90 days, opening a public review, paying unpaid waiting fees to eligible drivers, and creating a new route coordination department with representatives from field drivers. Then she looked at Caleb. She said the position of director of route coordination was his if he wanted it, not because she knew him, but because he was the only person in the room who had lived with the smell of asphalt, yard waiting slips, and the sound of a child coughing while calculating every gallon of fuel at a kitchen table. A 6-figure salary, full benefits, and the right to build a team from the field. To anyone else, it would have been a victory. To Caleb, it passed through him like light through cold glass. He looked at Valerie, at the empty chair where Derek had been sitting, and at the screen still showing the route plan taped back together. He had come here to ask for a job, but now that job was being placed in front of him, along with the full truth that the woman he trusted had tested his kindness, his mind, and his poverty like a private project. Caleb removed the visitor badge from his neck. He placed it on the table, right beside the torn plan. Valerie stepped half a step toward him, then stopped because his eyes asked her not to turn this moment into a public plea. Caleb spoke very low but clearly. He had come here looking for work to feed his daughter, not to become a prop in a rich person's real-life experience play. Valerie stood straight, but her hand tightened against the seam of her suit pants. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to hurt her in front of everyone to prove that he was hurt. He only gathered the torn papers and tucked them under his arm. Then he looked at her one last time. In that look were the diner, the $16, Mia's apartment, and every time she had had the chance to tell the truth but had chosen silence. On the screen, his numbers remained, enlarged enough for everyone to read. Caleb didn't look back, but Valerie knew he had heard the chairs shifting behind him, the sound of Derek being let out, and the board changing its tone. This should have been the moment a worker was recognized, but recognition that comes after a lie always carries a crack. He had wanted to walk into this place with his own skill, place his plan on the table, and hear someone truly read it. Now they had read it, but they had read it after he was torn apart in the lobby. After Valerie was no longer Val, after everything kind between them had been dragged into the same corporate file. That didn't save his trust. Valerie wanted to say she was sorry, that she had been wrong, that she had been afraid of someone treating her like a bank account one more time. But the boardroom wasn't the place to beg for forgiveness. Caleb turned and walked toward the door. No guard stopped him. No one had the right to stop him anymore. Caleb stepped through the doorway in his old work boots, refusing a salary that could save his family right away. Because if he accepted it in that moment, he feared Mia would grow up believing people were allowed to humiliate her father first, then pay him well and call it fairness. The door closed behind him. Valerie stood in the glass boardroom in front of a board that had just watched her win a corporate battle and lose the only thing that would never appear in the minutes. On the large screen, Caleb's plan was still clear. Every blue line, every route, every savings number. The board chair asked if she wanted to continue the meeting. Valerie did not answer right away. She looked at the visitor badge on the table beside the papers taped back together with clear tape. For the first time in many years, she had all the power needed to fix a system, but no longer had the right to step toward the man who had shown her that the system was crushing. Caleb got back to the apartment close to 9 p.m., carrying the torn folder under his arm and the blue tie loosened around his neck. He stopped outside the door longer than usual, smoothing the edges of the papers with his hand as if lining up the pieces more neatly could make the day feel less like a failure. In his pocket, his phone still held the contract termination email. Mia opened the door before he could knock. She was wearing dinosaur pajamas, mismatched socks, and holding the old teddy bear under her chin. She looked at her father's suit, then at the torn papers, then at his face. Caleb forced a smile first, the way adults do when they want children to believe everything hasn't completely broken yet. Mia didn't ask whether he got the job. She only stepped aside to let him in, then ran to the kitchen table and brought him the lunch bag from that morning, and still untouched. Caleb placed the papers beside the sink. He took off his work boots, showing the damp heels of his socks. The landlord had given him until 10 a.m. the next morning to pay the remaining rent, or the eviction filing would move forward. Caleb read the line again. Even though he already knew every period by heart, he had just turned down a salary that could have saved everything right in front of him. He didn't regret protecting his dignity, but when Mia placed the sandwich bag in his hand and quietly asked if he had eaten lunch today, his throat locked. He sat beside her and broke the sandwich in half, soft from sitting all day. Mia pushed the bigger part toward him. Caleb pushed it back. Father and daughter sat under the weak yellow kitchen light, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator. Mia told him her purple shoes had opened at the front again during gym class. She said very quickly that the teacher hadn't seen it, then lowered her head and stroked the teddy bear. Caleb looked at the shoes near the door. The old glue had peeled into a white line. After Mia fell asleep, Caleb sat in the bathroom and turned the shower on loud enough so she wouldn't hear him breathing. He placed his phone on the toilet lid, opened his bank account, checked the balance, then locked the screen. No calculation could save the morning. The man in the mirror had a tie mark on his neck, red eyes from lack of sleep, and an empty place on his wrist where his father's watch used to be. He stood there for a long time, then turned off the water, wiped his face, and went back to the living room to tape the route plan pages together with clear tape. At almost 10:30, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't the landlord pounding, and it wasn't a neighbor asking to borrow something. 3 soft knocks, evenly spaced. Caleb stood and looked through the peephole. Valerie stood in the hallway with no guards, no chairwoman's suit, and no heels. She wore the old gray sweats from their first night at the diner, her hair tied low, her face without makeup. In her hand was the $16 receipt pressed between 2 pieces of clear plastic, the grease mark still visible in the corner. Caleb opened the door, but he didn't step back. His eyes stopped on the sweats, then on the receipt. Valerie didn't try to come in. She stood under the flickering hallway light, both hands holding the receipt like something fragile. When she said she was sorry, her voice didn't sound like the voice in the boardroom. It was lower, rougher. She said she had lied because she was afraid. She was afraid every man who came close to her was looking for a way into her accounts, her shares, and the empire her father had left behind. For 10 years, flowers, rings, love confessions, and even quiet evenings had always turned into questions about voting rights, shares, investments, mansions, and media. She had met Caleb while defending herself, then used his poverty as a place to test whether kindness was real. When she reached that sentence, her voice broke. Tears ran down her chin and fell onto the collar of the old sweatshirt. Caleb watched her cry. He had seen many people cry when they lost money, reputation, or control. Valerie cried like someone finally seeing that she had placed a knife on another family's dinner table and called it self-defense. He didn't step forward to wipe her tears. He also didn't close the door. The distance between them needed to exist long enough so the apology wouldn't become another way to force him to forgive her. Valerie lifted the receipt. She said those $16 were the most honest thing she had received in years, and she had done the worst thing she could do with it. She had turned the person who gave it into a test. She wasn't asking Caleb to forget that. She was only asking to say everything before he decided. Caleb stepped back once. It wasn't an invitation. It was only permission for her to stand inside the doorway. Valerie stepped in and saw the kitchen table, the cough medicine, the purple shoes, and the papers taped back together. She placed the receipt beside the route plan, then took another folder from a cloth bag. There was no check. On the cover was Caleb Turner's name, and under it, the words author of the Field Route Coordination Proposal. She had launched his plan across the entire Northwest region that night, but not under her name, not under the strategy department, and not under any consulting team. Every internal document, board record, trial contract, and process ownership application listed Caleb as the original author of the idea. Valerie opened each page for him to see. There was a legal file number, the signature of an independent auditor, and a clause requiring that a portion of any savings in the first 12 months be used to pay back the missing yard waiting fees owed to freelance drivers. She had started fixing the system from the place he had pointed out, but this time she didn't touch his name. Caleb read very slowly. He stopped at the line, author of the idea, then moved to the part protecting driver rights. Those words didn't make the wound disappear, but they didn't feel like money thrown onto a table either. They felt like recognitions placed in the right spot, in a language the company couldn't easily take back once the emotion passed. Valerie said the director of route coordination position was still there, but it was no longer being placed in front of him as an emotional reward. The board had approved a formal hiring process, a contract, a salary, and a reporting line directly to the operations committee instead of through any executive with a conflict of interest. Caleb had the right to refuse. If he refused, his name would still remain on the plan and the repayments would still be made. Caleb looked at her when he heard that. For the first time in days, his eyes didn't have to brace so hard. Mia woke because she heard voices. She pulled the curtain aside and came out, her hair messy, her eyes still sleepy. She recognized Val first, then looked at her father as if asking permission. Caleb nodded. Mia walked closer to the table and saw the receipt in plastic in the thick folder. Valerie lowered herself to the girl's level but didn't touch her. She said she had hurt Mia's father and was trying to fix it by telling the truth. Mia looked at her for a long time, then asked whether her dad still had to sell the truck. The question made the entire kitchen go silent. Caleb placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Valerie answered very carefully that the company was temporarily restoring the contracts and paying back the held fees, but Mia's father would be the one to decide what happened next. Mia nodded as if that answer felt real enough because it didn't promise a miracle. Then she turned to Caleb and tugged his sleeve, pointing at the purple shoes. The front had opened a little more. Caleb gave a very quiet laugh, the first laugh in the apartment since Derek's email. It wasn't loud, but it made Valerie lower her eyes because they were stinging again. Valerie watched from the old kitchen chair and understood that making things right would have to pass through small moments like this. Letting Mia ask real questions, letting Caleb truly doubt her, and not turning that poor apartment into an emotional stage for her conscience. She didn't record the moment, didn't call an assistant, didn't send any message to the media. She only sat still, both hands on her knees, waiting for the father in front of her to decide with slow breathing and direct eyes. 2 weeks later, Caleb walked into Whitmore Atlas headquarters for the second time. This time, he wasn't wearing the old suit to beg. He wore a light blue shirt and new work boots, but still the kind made for warehouses, and around his neck was an employee badge with the correct job title. The official interview took place before the operations committee. Caleb answered every question about routes, costs, reporting ethics, and how to avoid turning drivers into invisible variables. No one called it a favor. The minutes clearly recorded that he had earned the position by skill. On his first day, he didn't go straight to the 52nd floor. He went down to the transfer yard in Kent, shook hands with every driver in the break room, and asked which doctor had kept them waiting the longest, who was still owed waiting fees, and who had paid for repairs that the contract should have covered. Valerie watched from a distance in a simple coat. She didn't step in. She had learned that if she wanted to respect Caleb, she first had to let him stand where he belonged on his own feet. Spring came to Seattle with softer rain. Mia got new purple shoes, the kind that didn't light up because she said she was grown now. Caleb still kept the old pair on the shelf near the door after washing them clean and gluing them one last time. Valerie didn't move into their lives with a penthouse key or a private car. She came through dinners in the small apartment, through washing dishes after meals, through sitting and listening to Mia practice spelling words. Some days Caleb was still angry when he remembered the marble lobby. Some days Valerie still put her hand into her pocket by habit, looking for paper to tear. But this time she spoke before silence could ruin something. 1 year later, they got engaged at Betty's, the diner under the Spokane Street overpass. No press, no five-star hotel. The corner table near the window had been wiped cleaner than usual, and the neon sign still blinked with half the word missing. Caleb placed a simple ring beside the plate of meatloaf, and Valerie placed the laminated $16 receipt between them like a small witness. Mia sat beside her father, smiling so hard the gap in her front teeth showed again before the new tooth had fully grown in. When Vala said yes, Caleb didn't see a billionaire. He saw the woman who had learned to return the truth before asking for love. When Caleb refused the director position in that glass boardroom, many people might have said he was foolish. He was behind on rent, his daughter needed new shoes, and his truck could be repossessed at any moment. But there are moments when people aren't just deciding what they will eat tomorrow. They are deciding whether their children will remember their parents standing tall or bowing their heads because they were too afraid of losing the next meal. I think that is why this story touches people. Caleb wasn't great because he was poor. He was great because at his most desperate moment, he still kept the line between needing help and being turned into a test subject. He was willing to work, willing to learn, and willing to accept a fair opportunity, but he wouldn't sell his dignity in exchange for pity wrapped inside a high salary. Valerie also wasn't saved by her money. She was saved by finally daring to look straight at her own mistake. A real apology is the act of fixing what you have the power to fix without demanding that the person you hurt be grateful. She put Caleb's name into the legal records, protected the rights of the drivers, and gave him the right to reviews without being erased from his own value. That is what mature redemption really looks like. If today you are going home exhausted, counting every gallon of gas, every bill, or worrying about every meal for your child, I hope you remember this. Your bank account may hit zero, but your human worth doesn't. People may look at your worn-down shoes or your sweat-soaked uniform and judge you, but the pain you carry quietly and the way you still reach out to help others even when you yourself don't have enough, all of it carries weight. If this story reminded you of a quiet worker fighting every day for their family, comment with the word hope below. not as a slogan, but as a statement that no one deserves to be turned into a test for their own kindness. And if you need a place to believe that justice may take the long way around but still arrive at the right time, please like this video and subscribe to Single Mom Billionaire Story. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. I'll see you in the next story where one small act of kindness may change an entire life.